So I'll introduce our speaker for today. Today we have with us Silvia Costales, and she's giving us an introduction to neurofeedback for therapists. Silvia is a psychotherapist in private practice in Santa Rosa. In addition to private practice, she spent 8 years working in community agencies, including Options Recovery Services in Berkeley, and creating and running school counseling programs in East Oakland. Silvia discovered and began training in neurofeedback in 2010. She was board certified in neurofeedback in 2014 and now sits on the board of directors for the International Society for Neurofeedback and Research. So welcome, Silvia.
Hello. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm really grateful for all of you being present here and giving me the opportunity to speak about neurofeedback, which is something I'm very passionate about. I think it's a really powerful and effective intervention in mental health care, and I expect it to grow in the future. I'd like for it to be more widely available because there's no shortage of people who could benefit from it. And so by talking to you today, I hope to help encourage that proliferation and maybe inspire some of you to incorporate neurofeedback in your own services. To start out, I have a little quote that I heard shortly after I got introduced to neurofeedback. Frank Duffy, doctor from Harvard, very impressive, said that in my opinion, if any medication had demonstrated such a wide spectrum of efficacy, it would be universally accepted and widely used. It is a field to be taken seriously by all. I'm a little nervous, I'm going to admit that. So I wanted to also thank my husband for being here. He's been really wonderfully supportive, and I'm very lucky to be married to him. And I want to thank a lot of friends who supported me in being here today and helped me rehearse and so on and so forth. But back to Frank. When I heard this, I thought, why? Why are people saying things like this? And I've learned why over the years. I completely agree at this point, and so I'm hoping that what I share with you today will also leave you with a similar impression. So the first client I want to share with you, I had been working with in psychotherapy for a few years, maybe a year and a half, a male in his late 50s who had been severely neglected and abandoned in infancy, and then adopted, had a long history of psychotic depressions, delusions, and periods of homelessness, and had done more than 10 years of intensive psychotherapy already. This person had tremendous difficulty with relationships, was able to sustain some friendships, but relationships were fraught, if not impossible, and was highly sensitive to my appearance changing from session to session. So probably a client that you can relate to, and relate to working with. I slowly introduced the concept of neurofeedback to this client and talked about, I'm going to touch you, I'm going to put sensors on your head, and then eventually we tried it and we started. I was working with him for twice a week, and this was a person who was triggered pretty much every day by some, interaction or encounter that he would have in his environment. And slowly, he said things like, I'm feeling more relaxed. I remember he noticed that his reading and comprehension had improved. Trying to think some of the other little things. But what I'll never forget was the day about 6 to 8 weeks in where he said to me, I've been triggered maybe 2 or 3 times this whole month, and it wasn't even that bad. Those were his words. So I knew that a real sea change had happened in this person's life, and that I had improved or helped to improve his quality of life. We still continued in psychotherapy. Neurofeedback and psychotherapy are beautifully synergistic, but one does not replace the other by any means. And in fact, I think that neurofeedback, while it sometimes is just a standalone intervention, really works best with other supports. And I'll explain more about that later. I mentor psychotherapists who are learning to do neurofeedback, and I actually took note of a couple cases one of my mentees shared with me the other day, because I thought they were pretty extraordinary. This is someone just starting out doing neurofeedback, which is not to imply that it's easy, because it's very complicated. But she was working with an entrepreneur in his 60s with a lot of childhood trauma, physical abuse, a physically abusive father, domestic violence in the home. And this person's a real workaholic and had been an insomniac for 3 decades. They've done, after 17 sessions, he reported that he was sleeping soundly through the night. Another client she described was a highly reactive bipolar disorder diagnosis, long-term psychotherapy client, one who had been referred to her for EMDR, and she was working with this client with EMDR. But they switched to neurofeedback, and they were 36 sessions in, so it was by no means a quick or overnight kind of thing. But the client one day suddenly requested to do an EMDR session. Wanted to process through some things that were coming up, and my mentee tells me it was remarkable because she was present to her adult self the entire time, and that had never happened before. And there came a point in the session where the client says, "I've been waiting for my mother to take care of me all my life, and I'm tired of waiting. I'm not going to wait anymore. I'm an adult now." So that gives me goosebumps just to tell it every time, and I think it's pretty remarkable. So some other examples from my own work. I saw a female in her 60s with a lot of developmental trauma. She'd been depressed 40 years, in and out of the hospital, on numerous medications. I began working with her, and I remember I would consult with her therapist regularly. She was in an intensive psychotherapy. And the therapist said to me, it's like she's woken up out of a coma. Let's see. I had younger people their problems tend to resolve a little more quickly. I mean, it's just like psychotherapy. But I had a female in high school, junior in high school, and she was reporting all kinds of panic attacks and up all night crying and migraines. And one of my colleagues referred her to me because she thought, that all sounds really physical. She sent it to Silvia. And I was worried. I was like, what is going on in this young woman's life that she's having all these symptoms? But she came in with one of her parents and just seemed like a really sweet family. And so I just did neurofeedback to begin with to see let's see what happens if I just do neurofeedback. And I found out a little bit about her personality and worked with that a bit, but mostly I just did neurofeedback. This is my fastest work. We were done with treatment in 27 sessions. She was symptom-free almost from the start. And at the end, she said, I can't even remember what it was like to wake up and cry at night. I can't remember the last time that happened. And she's welcome to come back anytime if she needs a tune-up, and I haven't heard from her, so I'm assuming everything's good. Let's see. Yes? Yes, I'm going to get to that, but I thought I would start with the stories just to give you a feel first. I'm going to go quite in depth about neurofeedback. I'm going to try to get through this list faster. I had a 26-year-old male who came in and had been insomniac, told me he'd been insomniac since age 4. And it was so bad lately that he was drowsy during the day and getting complaints at work. And this was a really bright young person, and he had done all the research on sleep hygiene and made all the adjustments, had blackout curtains at home, kept his bedroom cool, had done everything. And within, say, 6 sessions, he was doing much better during the day, got comments at work, oh, you're much better, we like whatever you're doing. But the sleep hadn't still wasn't sleeping through the night. So I switched to a different approach, and about 11 sessions into that approach, suddenly he slept through the night and every night after that, which was pretty life-changing for this person. I had one of my big successes recently was a woman in her mid-20s, long history of depression and anxiety. Her therapist referred her to me. Medication had been unsuccessful. Reported to me the first day we met, I feel good 1 or 2 minutes a day, maybe every couple of days. I feel 1 or 2 minutes of positive emotion every couple of days or so. Depression, rated her depression at 8 or 9 out of 10, and her anxiety at 6 or 7 out of 10. In 14 sessions, she was symptom-free. I actually can hardly believe it. And we just terminated after 33 sessions. So young, not on any medication, usually works better that way. But that was a success. I think that, I've actually, well, okay, I'm not going to say that. I'm going to move forward because I'm going on and on. So let me start to answer your question. What is neurofeedback? Let me start to define what it is. Neurofeedback is a subset of biofeedback. Biofeedback is any process by which you measure something about the body and reflect that information back to the subject, which the goal of which is to help them regulate themselves better. There's biofeedback of heart rate, breath, galvanic skin response, the amount of sweat, the surface of your skin. EMG biofeedback, that's electromyograph, muscle biofeedback, so how tense, what is your muscle tone, and that can help you to learn to relax your muscles and your musculature. Neurofeedback is a subset of biofeedback, specifically biofeedback of the EEG. But actually, let me say one more thing about biofeedback. I like to use the example of a mirror. If I asked you right now to sit up straight in your chair to improve your posture, you could sit up straight in your chair. You'd have a sense of how to do that. But if I put a mirror in front of you, you would have more information. Like I might look in the mirror and be like, oh, my left shoulder's up high. Okay, and now I know I'm standing up better. That is biofeedback. So neurofeedback is when we reflect back the brain's electrical activity to the subject. EEG is a fancy word for that signal that we measure at the scalp that reflects the neurons firing below the surface. Your 100 billion neurons in your brain are all firing all the time at different rates, and it creates a signal. This EEG word literally stands for electroencephalogram, which means electrical brain drawing. And this is an example of an EEG. There's 18 traces here. So the traces, each line represents a sensor that's in a different place on the head. And you can even see that the signal looks different at some of the sites than other sites. Like my guess would be these bigger waves are probably alpha, and there's more alpha generated toward the back of the head. So I would assume that these sensors are probably somewhere around the back of the head. And so let me say a little more about EEG. In neurofeedback, when we measure this little signal that's coming from the scalp, we're looking specifically at 1 to 40 hertz, approximately. Hertz means cycles per second. So that's how many times these neurons are firing and quieting, and it makes an oscillation. How many times per second does this little neuron fire? We can break that signal into different bands. Let me go with my slide a little bit. Hertz means cycles per second, so we have names for the bands. We can break it up. Those very slow waves at 1 to 3 cycles per second are called delta. Then we have theta, alpha, SMR, which means sensory motor rhythm, and I'll explain that in a moment. Beta and gamma. I'll show you, here's another illustration of the brain waves. So alpha waves are called alpha waves, alpha being the first letter, because they're the dominant rhythm in the adult human brain. The dominant frequency in the adult human brain is 10 cycles per second, approximately. And so when Hans Berger in 1920 discovered the EEG or started measuring EEG, he noticed alpha waves, right? They stood out on the other picture I just showed you. And so that's why he named those first, and that's alpha. And so, as might stand to reason, this being representative of electrical activity in the brain, so if you're thinking about your human body in terms of activation or arousal, you go from sleep to being very alert and present and active in the world. Your electrophysiology corresponds to that. So typically you want to be somewhere in the middle where you're present, but you're relatively calm, like you are right now. When you start to get drowsy or drift off more into like a reverie state, you're going to create more theta. And when you're sleeping very deeply, you'll see that delta waves become dominant. Correspondingly, as you engage in a task and your brain is attending more to outside stimuli, and you're taking in all kinds of information, you need to process all that information in order to interact with your environment. Your brain goes faster, and that's beta waves. Gamma waves are associated with like packets of information moving quickly, so it's like intuitive insights. They've measured EEG of long-term meditators, and they tend to have high amplitudes of gamma. Another way to think about this signal coming from the brain is like a chorus. So in a chorus, you have singers who are singing low notes and singers singing high notes, sopranos and altos and baritones. And if everyone starts singing the same note loudly, that amplitude, like that, each, soprano is like a band. And that amplitude increases in that band when everybody's singing in that note. Does that make sense? Okay. So I want to give a little history of neurofeedback. And a lot of people talk about Barry Sterman when they talk about the history of neurofeedback. Barry Sterman was a scientist at UCLA, and in 1967 he had a bunch of cats that he got from the pound, I think like 40 cats. And he was reading their EEG. He was measuring their EEG. And he wondered if he could use operant conditioning to impact or make changes in the EEG. So operant conditioning is a concept you probably remember from Psych 101. But in order to remind you about operant conditioning, I have a little video that I hope will play on that screen. Yes. I just have to get my mouse over there. There it is. All right. Oh, it's not coming down. There we go. Okay. So I'm sure that Barry Sterman's cats didn't have cute little hats like that. But instead of making them ring a bell in order to get treats, every time they increased the amplitude of their SMR, and I'll go back and explain that, they would get milk. So SMR is 12 to 15, are you seeing that one? Yeah, it's at the bottom there. 12 to 15 hertz in the human brain, sensory motor rhythm. What do I mean by that? It is the dominant rhythm in the brain along the sensory motor strip, which is an area of the brain, like if I were wearing a headband from ear to ear, where the highest concentration of sensory and motor neurons are. So these are the neurons that your brain uses to communicate to the body and for the body to send messages to your brain. So to send out motor instructions to your body to move around and to pick up, where I am in space and all that kind of thing. In the human brain, and in cats' brains, the dominant frequency along here is called SMR, sensory motor rhythm. And so he measured that little bandwidth, and when he saw the amplitude go up, the cats would get milk. So what he noticed after a while is that these cats that had the SMR training these were some crazy cats from the pound. Some of them were very erratic. But the ones that got the SMR training were pretty calm, chill cats. Like they would be playful and get up and do stuff when it was time to do that, and they were very cool and mellow the rest of the time. Then Sterman was hired by NASA to study rocket fuel toxicity. Now the effect of rocket fuel is that it induces seizure. And if you think about the electrophysiology of the brain, seizure is the most disorganized EEG, right? It's when your EEG goes crazy. And what he noticed was that the cats that had the SMR training had a much higher threshold for seizure. So they could be exposed to more of the toxin longer before they started to seize. So something about the training helped to stabilize their EEG. And Sterman had a lab assistant who was epileptic, and she subsequently started to train herself. So this is often described as how neurofeedback got started. Neurofeedback is an evidence-based treatment. That experiment was 1967, so the research goes back 50 years now. There's no shortage of research. In fact, it's also grown like on a J curve, and that curve went vertical sometime in the last decade. So if you type in PubMed, neurofeedback, depression, you're going to find articles from all over the world, Brazil, South Korea, like the research is going on everywhere. There's really no shortage of research, it's just that it takes some time to go through it. But when people actually do examine it, they usually come away pretty impressed. The ISNR, the organization I'm on the board of, they have a pretty useful website and the bibliography on the website of research where you can look up particular issues. I don't know if it's been updated very recently, to be honest. And then there's actually a book called Evidence-Based Practice in Biofeedback and Neurofeedback. It's in its 3rd edition already in 2016. It's published by the American Association of Psychophysiology and Biofeedback. So how does it work? We have this idea of operant conditioning from Barry Sterman. And certainly, this is part of how neurofeedback works. Our experience shows this. We can create a protocol to reward or indicate to the client when they've increased the amplitude of a particular bandwidth or decrease the amplitude of a particular bandwidth in order to sort of shape the EEG toward norms that we have. We have several databases of normative EEG. We have where you take a normal, healthy population, you look at their EEG. We know what normal, healthy EEG looks like. So if you take a particular individual and you look at their EEG and it's really departing from this, and those departures align with their symptoms that they're reporting to you, you know that this might be a target for treatment. However, the brain is the most complicated structure we know of in the universe, and it has some very fascinating properties, such as neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity and learning, in my mind, are very similar concepts. And there's a way that the brain seems to learn from neurofeedback or reorganize given that information that it takes in, that often you get results faster than you would through an operant conditioning paradigm where you need repetition. So both, I think, are true. Neuroplasticity is a really fascinating concept, really only recently that we've come to understand it and embrace it. I think we have yet to fully realize its implications. And I highly recommend books by Norman Doidge to help flesh some of that out. He's an analyst from Canada, I forget where. Anyway, and he writes, really, it's a very entertaining book, his first one, The Brain That Changes Itself. He gives all kinds of description of neuroplastic cures, like people, all kinds of issues, like pornography addiction, autism, attention deficit, and different ways that they've worked, scientists who are developing novel ways of working with these issues. He actually doesn't even mention neurofeedback in the first book. He's got a chapter of it on it in the second book. So like I said, we have the capacity to learn, well, I didn't say this exactly, but we have the capacity to learn because our brains are plastic. Learning is a form of plasticity in action. But neuroplastic change is different from the change that we normally, the way we normally think about it in medicine. Neuroplastic change is functional change. Our current medical model emphasizes structural change. So let me give you an example of that. In Parkinson's disease, for example, from what I understand, Parkinson's disease is a disease that degrades or deteriorates the actual structure of the brain. The neurology gets degraded or diminished. And 75% of that disease process has already taken place by the time people tend to be symptomatic with Parkinson's. So what does that mean? It means that your neurology is highly adaptive, and in the even having lost 75% of itself, it can reorganize to adapt and try to cover all the bases and still function. So there's a real difference there between structure and function in the brain in terms of how we look at it. And the EEG is not a good measure of structure. It has some correlations or some correspondences to structure, but it reflects the brain's patterns of activation or its functional activity. So EEG, this functional biomarker, we can measure it a lot of ways. I can just put one sensor on your head and get one of those little traces and find out something about your EEG. In order to study or analyze it more comprehensively, we can do something called QEEG, which is quantitative EEG, and we measure 19 different sites simultaneously, and with eyes open and eyes closed, and we compare to those normative databases I was talking about. So and then we find out if this person's EEG departs a lot from the norm. Now, someone could be like a concert pianist, and they're likely to have some unusual EEG, but that's not a problem. So it's important to interpret it well, and also not take too much from the QEEG, I think. In the court of law, any one brain analysis doesn't stand up by itself. You need several to prove any kind of a point. And the QEEG is no different. It has a wealth of information, and it shouldn't be underestimated, but it shouldn't be overestimated either. EEG is also used, there's something called RxEEG, which is used by psychiatrists to better determine what medication to prescribe an individual based on their EEG. So, for instance, you may have met clients who have problems with attention, but are also highly anxious. And sometimes you might not pick up on that anxiety, or they might not even be complaining about it. But if you give them a stimulant, you're likely to precipitate a panic attack. So you can look at the EEG and kind of get a warning on that, for instance. And we know things about EEG patterns where certain medications work better than others. So patterns of activation can lend themselves to differential diagnosis, but not very neatly. Really, what the EEG suggests is more of a new model or a way to look at mental health with self-regulation at the center. And anyone here who's working with trauma is probably already familiar with this kind of idea. So one of my personal heroes is this woman, Sebern Fisher. She's been doing neurofeedback since the 90s, and she wrote this brilliant book about working in neurofeedback. She specializes in working with developmental trauma. And it's a great book that I highly recommend, not only to learn about neurofeedback, but she's a really good clinician. And she's thought about the way her clients present from every angle, including psychodynamic, and she has a long-standing relationship with Marsha Linehan, so she has a deep DBT perspective, and she puts all that together with what she now understands about brain physiology, and really teases apart a lot of questions that come up when you start to think about, well, where does neurofeedback fit alongside psychotherapy and other interventions for mental health? So Sebern says, after years of doing neurofeedback, I no longer see these long list of disorders or diagnoses I no longer see these disorders as distinct, but as individual manifestations of overwrought and dysregulated nervous systems. What is a dysregulated nervous system? Does anyone want to maybe volunteer a symptom they've observed from their practice? Do you want me to pass the microphone out for this? Well, I'll just repeat them.
Over-aroused all the time.
Over-aroused all the time. This is a client you might recognize.
I think it's a distorted reaction to an event or a stimulus.
Right, distorted reaction to an event or stimulus. Yeah, we know that anxiety starts to distort perception if it's too high, right?
Feels in danger, threatened.
A person who feels in danger or threatened all the time, right? In maybe the absence of any real danger or threat. Circumlocution. That's talking around and around about the same thing, is that right?
No, it's like switching from subject to subject.
Yes. Yeah. Tangential thinking, circumlocution.
I'm thinking there's evidence that depression is a result of overactive.
Yes.
Like a freeze response.
Okay, so Dawn is saying that depression, there's evidence that it's like a freeze response, so this can also represent a dysregulated nervous system. So that would be a nervous system that's kind of shut down or underactivated. It's very interesting in the EEG. You can pick out, I can pick out if I take a couple measurements very quickly, whether that's the kind of depression I'm looking at, or whether this person has an exhaustive depression, a stress-precipitated depression, where actually they've been anxious so long that they collapse from time to time because they're exhausted. And this is something you can differentiate, so that's what I was saying about differential diagnosis in the EEG. There's this work by Richard Davidson. He wrote a book called The Emotional Brain. When he first started studying emotion in the 80s, I think, nobody was studying emotion. And he used EEG because it's fairly simple technology to measure this electrical signal. So he didn't need a lot of money to do this research. And what he found, that we still use today, every day when we're doing neurofeedback, is that left frontal lobe is underactivated very often. If you see that the left frontal lobe is running slower, maybe higher proportion of slow wave to fast wave in the left frontal lobe versus the right, 9 times out of 10, this person's going to tell you, I'm depressed, it's hard for me to think any positive thoughts about anything or really enjoy anything. So I often say, that Freud, if he were alive, would be so excited about EEG and neurofeedback. He started out as a neurologist. He thought that there were neurological underpinnings to everything that he was observing as a therapist and describing, and that's why he called, that's how he came up with these words like neurosis. So let's see. It's more accurate to say that neurofeedback promotes optimal nervous system self-regulation than that it treats any specific condition. And feedback, and the way I think about this and explain this, although it's a very difficult thing to explain, I think, again, because the brain is vastly complex, but that feedback is about 70% of what your brain is doing at any given time. It's talking to everything else in your body in order to maintain homeostasis in your body. Just like your thermostat on your wall measures the temperature in your house in order to keep the temperature steady in your house. So feedback is inherent to our nervous systems and how they regulate themselves. And when you add neurofeedback, this live, real-time, exquisitely attuned, incredibly real-time reflection of the brain's activity, there just seems to be something inherently compelling about that, which I think might be explained by the way that this is how our brains develop, right? we're as babies, we're by no means, developed as human beings yet. It takes us years, and it takes us years of attuned relationship, getting that mirroring, ideally from a caregiver who can reflect back to us what's going on inside of us, and a rich environment. So I think that part of the way neurofeedback is so effective in helping people improve their self-regulation in whatever way it might need to be improved is not so much that we target it with the neurofeedback, but that we provide the neurofeedback, the mirror, and the brain itself decides, how can I best use this information, and how can I best operate from here forward. So clinical uses of neurofeedback are many and varied. This list is based on things that we have research for, using neurofeedback for. However, Parkinson's is up on that list. Neurofeedback doesn't do anything about the disease process of Parkinson's. The disease process will go on. This person, if it's untreated or whatever, they're going to continue to deteriorate and die. However, the neurofeedback can support the neurology that's remaining to do the best with what it still has. And so people do have temporary gains or improvements in their functioning, that may improve their quality of life for a little while. Did you have a question?
I don't see anything about personality disorders.
Okay, so, the question is, I don't see anything about personality disorders. I'll give you my shorthand answer for that. Obviously, we know as therapists that personality disorders are very complex and entrenched, right? And the brain is nothing if not completely networked. So I think that a personality disorder is something that is very complex in terms of where it resides in the brain and what rhythms might reflect it in the EEG. So in my experience, what the neurofeedback can help with is it improves that, or the person's level of arousal improves. They find a more, maybe reduce their anxiety, if they have anxiety, which even if they don't appear to, often they might. And so they're going to be a little less defended and more receptive to learning and working on their personality. But I think in the case of a personality disorder, that's one where definitely neurofeedback alone is not the answer. And I've joked to some of my colleagues that there's people in the neurofeedback field that I think are kind of illustrate that. Because presumably they've had access to all the neurofeedback they could have. So what's a session like, you might be asking? One of my Redwood Empire CAMFT colleagues, lovely colleagues, modeled for me in my office the other day. And so what you can see here, I wonder if I can get a mouse over there. Yeah. So I attach sensors to the person's head, and I use a little paste that's in that little tub there to the left of the client to stick the sensor on. It's a salty paste. It conducts electricity, it picks up the signal. And typically in a regular session, I don't put more than about 5 leads or sensors on the person's head. If I'm measuring QEEG, then it's a little messier. They're probably going to want to go home and wash their hair afterwards. But I wipe it off with a gauze pad and some alcohol afterwards, and most people are not bothered. And I have a comfy chair for them to sit in, and they have a monitor in front of them. And I sit across, so I can track my client carefully in my chair, which is the orange chair over there. And I have my laptop in front of me, and here's my laptop with my screen during a session. So the feedback, the reflection of their brain's activity is coming back to the subject in the form of sound, little beeps or tones from my computer that are varying in pitch and frequency and sometimes volume a little bit. And visual feedback can come in the form of, there's like video games that stop and start when the person is meeting the desired metrics. But most of the time these days I'm using video. So they can pick anything they want to watch, although I try to pick something relatively calm like a documentary. I have a Netflix account. It'll remember where they were the next session, and we just pick right up where they were in their show. And there's a dimmer screen over the video. So the screen brightens and dims in intensity to reflect their brain's activity. So it's a visual feedback and auditory feedback. And one of the things that I love about neurofeedback is how incredibly non-invasive it is. Apart from putting sensors on my client, there's nothing else. There are forms of neurofeedback where an electrical stimulation, a very small signal, comes back to the brain. There are all kinds of neurostimulation techniques out there these days, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But pure neurofeedback, traditional neurofeedback, just sound and visual. When I do neurofeedback with people in my office, I'm a huge stickler for informed consent, particularly because people are unfamiliar with neurofeedback. And I really believe, if you're going to do something, you should understand what it is before you get into it, know what you're getting into. And unfortunately, there's still a fair amount of people in the neurofeedback world who will tell you that there's no side effects with neurofeedback, which is absolutely untrue. Because if I can change or impact your brain's functioning, I can certainly create a side effect. And however, neurofeedback side effects do tend to be minimal and fleeting. There's some research about this even. There's a great article by Corey Hammond. I think he's at University of Utah. And the most common reported side effect is a headache. But I'm really clear about side effects from the start and having my clients report to me after each session, particularly at the beginning when I'm trying to find out what is the best neurofeedback for this person? What protocol will this person's brain really like and respond well to? And so I have to start somewhere. I used to feel kind of arrogantly superior to psychiatrists and their medications and all those side effects until I realized that I really, I am it's like I'm giving a medication and I don't know what dose the person needs yet. So I might give them too much at first or too little, and I'll be able to tell by their report. So it's really important that they can work with me and report back. And as long as they report any undesirable effect that the neurofeedback is having, I know that that effect will go away. The only reason it would continue is if they didn't tell me and we continued the same training over and over and we were reinforcing that effect. So treatment prognosis really depends on the individual. This was maybe coming across a little bit when I described my cases. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt you, but I didn't understand the second sentence up there.
Sure. No lasting harm is possible without repetition of the neurofeedback that is creating an undesirable effect.
Okay, I guess I'm just not reading it correctly. No lasting harm is possible?
Without repetition.
That lasting harm is possible with repetition?
That actually occurred to me when I wrote the slide at some point, and I was like, oh. I think it would take a lot of repetition, because I think our brains tend to self-correct. You got it, okay.
Kind of what you're saying is that you don't want somebody who's real pleasing and just says, no, I'm fine.
I've had problems with that, yeah.
So you need somebody who actually will say, I'm starting to get a headache.
Right, clients who will just tell me what I want to hear is very dangerous, yeah. Yeah. I have one case of that that I'm thinking of.
Some of the symptoms that occur, when you know, oh, this shouldn't be happening,
You'll feel really drowsy after the session, underactivated, groggy, not really able to engage or focus. Or alternatively, you'll feel kind of keyed up, maybe more anxious than you want to be, or a little irritable. And most likely it will affect your sleep. So you'll be like, wow, it took me forever to fall asleep last night after that session. Or I was waking up all night. I didn't sleep well. Yeah. Conversely, people say, and people actually, I think more than half the time, they have a good response from the first session. And that's because it seems like almost any feedback is good feedback at the beginning. The brain's like, woo, okay, this is new. And so they'll say things, oh, I slept amazing, or I had dreams for the first time and I can't remember. I felt so calm, et cetera, et cetera. But then the brain gets a little pickier about what I'm feeding back to them, so I have to track them really carefully at the beginning. Okay, so So yeah, there's this assessment period, I would say about the first 10 sessions where I'm figuring them out and dialing their treatment in. And then if we're getting the symptom relief, we want to repeat what we're doing enough that I think that effect will hold, like they'll learn this new pattern. And I have just a rough idea, rule of thumb to do 20 sessions, but it really varies with the person. And when they're satisfied and we've repeated it for a little while, we'll just start to taper. So I like to see people ideally twice per week, but if they've been feeling good for a while and they want to see, will this last a week? So we go for a week. Their symptoms haven't returned, then maybe we go a month, their symptoms haven't returned, and we're done. And they can always come back if they need to, but the effects of neurofeedback tend to be very durable and lasting. I have some research about that to show you later.